and welcome to Navigating Thought Leadership. I'm Lucia Rahilly, Editorial Director at McKinsey Company, and your host for this series of live webinars sponsored by the Global Thought Leadership Institute at APQC. Quick note before we start, this series is designed to give you the opportunity to engage with some of the foremost leaders and practitioners in the field of thought leadership today. We'll be holding these webinars on a monthly cadence, and you can see our roster by visiting APQC's website at apqc.org/GTLI. We would love for this session to be as interactive as possible. We want to make it useful. We want to make it engaging for you. We don't want to talk at you this entire time. So we invite you to please send along your questions using the Zoom chat functionality, and I will do my best at least to field as many of them as possible. Today, Liz Bolshaw, EY's Global Content Strategist extraordinaire and one of my fellow founding members of the advisory board at the Global Thought Leadership Institute. Liz looks after thought leadership globally for EY, and we are thrilled to have her with us today to talk us through a range of issues, how research-driven content fits into EY's global content strategy, what kinds of storytelling they're experimenting with, what they're up to with Gen AI, and more. Liz, welcome, and thanks for being together with us today.
Thanks, Lucia. Really excited to be here.
Let's start with some basics. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to this kind of research-driven publishing that, for better or for worse, as we were discussing before this webinar started, we call thought leadership?
So I had quite a mixed career. I started in academic book publishing, slow and thoughtful. And I then flipped and joined the Financial Times and became a journalist. And that was quite a good culture shock and had to do things very fast. I was mainly writing on leadership and management issues, some business education, so those kinds of things. And I got a call from EY saying that that they had a job they thought I was. I also wrote about entrepreneurship, and this role was as the entrepreneurship analyst. And I rejected the call, and I said, no, there's no way I would join a big four firm, absolutely not. And I continued to reject until, in the end, I caved, and so I did. And I joined EY as a lead analyst for our private markets and our entrepreneurship, which is a big part of what EY does, an important strand. You may know the World Entrepreneur of the Year we do every year. And then after about 3 years, I don't know whether I got bored or whatever, but I decided that I would go it alone. And I set up a very small boutique kind of content advisory firm. I wrote for a lot of people, BCG and PwC, all sorts of people. And that was fascinating because I got quite an insight into how other people do their thought leadership. And then I got a tap on the shoulder to return to this, which was a new role. And I have to say, it's fundamentally, I head up the editorial team within our insights function. And we call our thought leadership insights, but it includes a very substantial number of research analysts, sector specialists, all kinds of research and analytics folk, as well as an editorial team. And I'm heading up the editorial team.
And if I could stay on that for a second, sort of selfishly, we hire a lot of editors at McKinsey off the journalism track. What did you find most challenging about transitioning from the kinds of journalism that you did at the FT to working in thought leadership at EY and, with your various other clients at your content advisory firm?
I think you have to learn that, especially working for a partnership, requires a very different. You have to remember you're a small cog in a very large wheel. And certainly at EY, we have almost 400,000 people working at EY in multiple independent firms, 700 offices around the world. I mean, it's very large. The FT wasn't small, but it was tiny compared with EY. So that was the first thing. And secondly, I think culturally, for anybody who's been in journalism, professional services and consultancy firms are incredibly risk averse. You know, there's a huge amount of not wanting to say anything at all that might possibly put your head above the parapet. And obviously, journalism's the opposite. You know, you're encouraged to be a bit provocative. I like to think that I've brought a little bit of provocative thinking into what we do. But we're always balancing that against risk and obviously reputational risk. And as a Big Four firm, you're obviously very concerned about independence and other things. So I think you're always balancing those things. The other thing that is very difficult if you come from a journalistic background is the speed at which we do things, which is unbelievably slow. I mean, you cannot believe how long it takes to make decisions, to get things off the ground. That's, again, a cultural shift. And I think you either make it or you don't enjoy it, and you get spat out and you go somewhere else.
Yeah, the cycle time one is super interesting. We have former journalists who come on board and they expect that they need to have, they're used to having their byline out within weeks, and then it can take, elephant style gestation to get some of these pieces out. So that is, we've seen that adjustment. So those are some of the challenges of shifting from journalism to thought leadership. What in your background do you feel like prepared you most for working in this field? And what would you recommend for folks who are coming up in thought leadership today? What are the traits that you think contribute to success in this field?
I certainly think it was helpful for me to have had my first career as in book publishing and editorial. And I did academic book publishing. So I was then had to work across lots of disciplines that I knew absolutely nothing about. I mean, we published a load of academic journals, including The Lancet, which is the medical journal, no longer part of the publishing group I used to work for. But, I was meeting authors who, had PhDs in astrophysics. And believe me, I mean, there is no way I could understand that content. So I think you become quite humble. And I've always been massively curious, which is why I made a reasonably good journalist. I love asking questions and finding out about stuff that I know nothing about. So there's a kind of curiosity element that I think is really helpful for thought leadership. But I think you also have to be humble. And I think that's sometimes difficult because I think people come with a sense that, they know what they're doing and everybody should listen to them. And you learn quite quickly that you have to find a way of persuading people of your point of view. You have to prove that what you have to say is going to help them. We are very much a service to the business. I often think we're a bit like the civil service to the government. We are here to make them better, to make everything go better. But we're not actually, it's not our point of view in the end. What we're trying to do is to clarify a point of view, to make it, crystal clear, to make it really as sharp as possible, to make it have an impact. So I think if you have some of those backgrounds, that's useful. I think journalism is great because you tend to be good at examining trends and being on top of things that are happening that are sort of bleeding edge. I think this is going to be increasingly important in thought leadership, that we need to stay abreast of things that are moving fast. People keep talking about technological change, obviously accelerating, but I think it's all kinds of change accelerating. I think we're living in a very, volatile world, and that means that ideas come and go quite quickly. I mean, it's not that long ago that we were all talking about the metaverse. I mean, who would talk about the metaverse today? So I think you have to kind of be quite good at first of all being abreast of what's going on, and secondly knowing what's likely to be a very short blip and what's more likely to be a bigger trend.
Super interesting. I mean, one thing that you said about humility reminded me of a time that I thought a story was like, I thought the most interesting story from a kind of outside-in perspective was a particular story, which is, I think, a journalism point of view. And the team kept saying, no, this is what my clients need to hear. This is what my clients need to hear. And I just thought, oh. But it worked, like it resonated. I was schooled in audience in that moment because these folks know their clients and they know what's on top of mind for their clients. And sometimes that negotiation can be tricky. But the story is not always what you think it is. It's not always the most provocative story, as you said.
No. And
So
we have a Venn diagram which I find very useful, and other people may as well on this call. And we have three main circles, and if you can imagine a Venn diagram with a bit in the middle. So in one circle we have what EY knows. So that's really our permission to play. You know, what's our history? Where do we really play? What do we really know? The second circle is what market trends are we observing? What's happening in the market? And then the third circle is what business leaders really care about.
Yeah, exactly.
And we use that. If we only hit two of those, we suggest that it's not actually an appropriate place to invest in thought leadership. But when you can hit all three, that's where our sweet spot is, and that's what we use to drive our strategic agenda forward.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I might hit you up for a slide on that. So let's talk about thought leadership at EY specifically and why it matters. What role do you think thought leadership plays in EY's business strategy?
So I think it's totally central. I think anybody in professional services or consulting would say that thought leadership is central to who we are. We sell the collective intelligence of the business, and we like to think that our thought leadership is a way of demonstrating and promulgating those ideas and sharing them with clients and future clients. So I think it's central. It's always been central. However, I think there's been a shift, and not just with us, but generally. Whereas before, I think we tended to think of thought leadership as being most important as a brand play, to establish awareness of your brand, to show that you were vaguely on top of a big topic. Whereas I think now we think that thought leadership has a part to play in every milestone along the buyer journey. So we look at how we can harness some of the research we do and sometimes package it differently, but actually to look at how that would impact a decision at different times with different audiences. So I think there's been a bit of a shift, but in terms of investing in it, EY has always really, certainly as long as I've known EY, it has invested heavily in thought leadership, and I don't think that will change, at least I hope not.
And you are EY's global content strategist. Talk to us about your content strategy and how that may have evolved over the past 4 or 5 years as EY's business strategy presumably has done. You talked about accelerating trends and so forth.
Yeah, so it's not a title. It's not a title that I chose. But I think our strategy has changed. So some years ago, probably I would say 7 or 8 years ago, there was a recognition in the firm that our thought leadership was pretty ungoverned. It was the Wild West. There were lots of people riding around and doing pretty much what they liked. And there was a sense that, we needed to put some guardrails around it, and we needed to dedupe a lot of things, because what happened was everybody had the same idea and we were producing things that were similar. So there was a way of putting our thought leadership together from an organizational point of view in global markets that also introduced some governance. And that governance is now quite strict. It helps us prioritize. We had, an absolute ambition to do fewer, bigger, better pieces. And in order to do that, we needed to explain, well, how do we prioritize? How do we judge what's a good idea as opposed to an idea that we don't think deserves to be really invested in? And beyond using that Venn diagram, we also look very carefully at, what's the hypothesis behind this piece of work? How are we developing interesting research methodologies that will test that hypothesis? And, what's the best way of bringing that eventually to market? So we obviously, and I know that you talked a lot with Francis of Accenture about this, we were closely with our brands and marketing colleagues, because there's no point in investing heavily in very exciting work and not understanding how you're going to get it into the hands of the people who matter to you. And you need to have decided that and thought about it before you embark on the journey. So I think it's really important for any, most organizations have separate research editorial functions to, in a sense, the marketing. And I think that's healthy. But I think it's also very important to understand that you need to work hand in glove.
Okay, I have many follow-up questions to ask on that piece that you just articulated. But before I get to those, I want to ask an audience question here about ROI, right? How do you handle educating the rest of the business about the value of thought leadership? And how do you get SMEs to prioritize it?
So on ROI, we are pretty focused on quite complex metrics. So we measure a lot of different things. We measure the things that most people would measure, like views and scroll depth and engagement kind of stats coming off our website. But we also increasingly look at other things. How often has a piece of thought leadership been used in a client conversation? We looked at earned media. Some of our pieces, it's much more important than others. I don't think every piece of thought leadership has the same ambition or the same aim. And I think you need to be very clear what it is you're doing. So, if we're doing something that has to do with government policy, for example, then being quoted in 3 or 4 government papers would be a real metric of success. Whereas there may be something else where we really want to get a lot of eyeballs onto something. It matters that a lot of people read it. So, you've got to be clear about what you're trying to do with it. But we have pretty sophisticated now dashboard of metrics that have different weightings. And we do look across a range of things. And increasingly, that dashboard will also be linked up to our CRM system. So we'll be able to really see how thought leadership is used in client service, in winning business, which will eventually probably be able to put a dollar amount on it, although we're not quite there yet. But that is probably the aim, where we really understand. I think the great thing that AI is able to help us with is to really understand much more about who's reading your material, when are they reading it, how are they reading it? Are they reading it on mobile? Are they downloading? What are they doing? And that sort of behavioral knowledge can really help inform our future program.
Mm-hmm. Do you think your leadership, the leadership of EY, really understands the value that that thought leadership confers for EY, or is that a case that you regularly have to make?
I think we do have to make it, and we probably should have to make it. I think it's fair to be challenged on what you do and the value you bring. And I think there are, as usual, I mean, there's not a homogenous group with the millions of partners we have. So it's a question of really, some people are much more close to thought leadership and what we do, and probably more aligned to it, probably more excited by it and get involved themselves. And they will probably have a better sense. And there'll be other stakeholders who, may not be aware or indeed may not value it. And I think it's very important that we, wherever we can, we make that value case. We need to be able to articulate what our value is to the business.
Mm-hmm. So we hear a lot from folks, and there may be our audience may have people among them who grapple with this challenge, confronting, how do I quantify the value of what I do in this field? Any suggestions for content leaders who are reckoning now with this challenge?
Well, I think you need to think very sort of clearly about it. So I think that what is a mistake is to talk about sort of inputs, which a lot of people do. We produced 75 research papers on X. It doesn't really matter. I mean, nobody's interested in quantity or output. What you need to think about is the impact you're having, constantly having to look at that Some of it is very long term. I mean, we're quite known for our surveys, and we don't just do surveys, but we do actually invest quite heavily in a number of global surveys every year. And some of them have very long lives. I mean, we're able to go back sometimes 18, 20 years, a longitudinal survey. And some of that data is invaluable because you can really see a trend over time that you wouldn't be able to see if you were just doing it once and done. So we try to do less that's once and done, although, we sometimes do that too. So I think being clear with your stakeholders that there are things that you're going to invest in, just as the business is investing in things that are long term. And thought leadership isn't a quick win. I mean, it can be, but that largely isn't why we do it.
Yeah, that's interesting. That speaks to one of the comments in the chat that there's not an immediate ROI on most of what we do. And so there has to be a change in point of view in the way that thought leadership is going to deliver that value. We've got a couple more interesting questions. I'm going to put a pin in them for now because they relate to formats, which we'll get to a little bit later in this discussion. I want to turn to the kind of how of thought leadership. In other words, how folks can execute and what they can do differently to take advantage of the value that thought leadership can offer. So let's start with where thought leadership sits within the organizational structure at EY. You alluded to this earlier. Talk to us about how it fits into the marketing group, etc.
So we're not part of a marketing function, but we are part of what we call markets. And global markets support all our member firms. So the other things that sit there would be our strategy. In other words, I don't mean the strategy we sell, but the strategy for our own firm, our competitive intelligence, business development, brand, so advertising, and also insights. And insights really is research and analytics. And each of these functions, these are all global functions that support all our member firms and all our service lines. So we have 4 different service lines, 6 major industry markets, 18 sectors, and we go across all of them. Now, that doesn't mean that individual countries don't have their own content teams, because they do, and particularly in the US, there's a very large team that are doing doing thought leadership for themselves. And sometimes we will take a study that has been done in the Americas, and we will, think that it's good to be globalized in some way, and we put it on a global site. So we work closely with some member firms, absolutely, on content, but we are the idea is anyway that we are the team that does the most in terms of our major studies and our major investments in that sense globally. Mm-hmm. So we sit in markets.
And do you have a bright line between research and marketing? You talked about working across the aisle, but what is this sort of like? Do marketing themes inform your research agenda, and how does that dynamic play out?
Yeah, I mean, I think without question, marketing is critical, because in the end, marketing helps us establish where we are, what our strategic priorities are for a year, or indeed for 3 years. And it would be very weird, and actually, I would say, in the end, not productive, if we didn't match what we do, if we didn't reflect our firm's priorities. But when it comes to more specific decisions, we have quite a lot of to and fro, and that includes with the business. So we have editorial boards that are, for us, they're sector-based, and they will set, the signature issues for that sector that the business sees. Insights have a seat at that table, and so does marketing, and we come together to look at those things. So it's very much a partnership, but with different swim lanes, I would say.
Can you say more about the editorial boards? We also have editorial boards, and it's a topic that are sector specific. It's the functioning of those boards is a topic that is a
Yeah,
motif in our in our dialogue. So
yeah.
I'm interested
So
in how they're working.
they're fairly new, and we've recently been through a restructuring. So many of the individual industry market leaders are globally are new in post, and so I wouldn't say I could tell you a huge amount about them, but the idea is certainly a good one. I think where um, the business, marketing, and insights for us, insights, research, whatever you call it, come together to really explore what those key market trends are, where we see the business growing. We're all living in quite difficult times at the moment, so it's very important, I think, that we are prioritizing where we, where in the end we think that there's value to be had. Otherwise, what are we doing?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. As you said before, UI has something like 400,000 employees. It's a massive
Yeah,
organization.
slightly under, but yes.
It's a behemoth. Talk to us about how you function as a central thought leadership team within such a huge organization.
So we increasingly are going to market through industry, through sector. So that has, in a sense, helped, I would say. But we also have four major service lines. So we have an audit or assurance line. We're in tax. We have strategy and transactions, and a consulting business. So each of those, if you like, delivery models is also very important, and we try carefully to ensure that our thought leadership is sometimes very focused on a particular service. So it's, we might be doing something on tax strategy. On the other hand, we might be doing something on banking or wealth and asset management, or so I think we're always straddling both service line and industry market, but increasingly we think that it's important that all the thought leadership we do has, as much as possible, a sector lens, even when it's a cross-sector theme. So, if I think about the broad themes that go across, if you look at sustainability or talent, or even tech transformation, those are perennial themes that are of interest to all our clients, no matter where they sit. But I think with thought leadership, if we can make sure that we explain how those broad themes impact a particular sector, it's much more valuable than if we just talk vaguely. So specificity is something I'm very keen
on. That kind of speaks to one of the questions in the chat. So I'm going to bring this question in here. In our context, we tend to create global pieces on these, what we call these broad themes like tech, transformation, and talent, etc., that you just named. And then we also have sector-specific pieces. Someone has asked, does EY create a primary piece tailored for a C-suite audience and then create derivatives that are tailored to a consultant or as a door opener for specific sellers that they might be more comfortable sharing, links to offerings and so forth. So a little bit more commercial. So there are maybe two questions embedded in that. One is, are you saying that you create a global piece that's sort of your tentpole on tech transformation, and then you take a sector lens, or you're just going straight to the sector lens? That would be one. And then second, like, how do you spin off these more commercial, like bring to market assets?
So for some of our studies, especially surveys, where we have enough of a base, we might do individual sector cuts on a particular survey because we think, we've got some really interesting things to say that are different, but it's only if the results are different. We don't routinely do it if actual results are the same. I think it's more that if we were doing a general piece, we would, within that general piece, we would have a chapter or sections that show how what we're seeing, those insights play out for an individual sector. And increasingly, I think that's a good way of doing it, because even if you're not in that sector, you learn from something, because often change happens, at the edge of a sector, between a sector and another sector. And so although I think it's really important to have that depth of expertise in sector, I think it's also true that it's great for us. Certainly, it's one of the things that we need to be doing, is to make the trends that we're seeing show how they may impact a different sector completely.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because the lines between the sectors have gotten blurrier as well,
Yeah.
right? So it can be easier to learn from another sector because some of these sectors are starting to overlap in different ways.
Absolutely. And, tech is really transforming things. I mean, even just people's business models, and, the value pools are changing. So, if you think about something like car manufacturing, OEMs, it's increasingly now it's a tech play. It's not really in heavy engineering anymore. So I think there are things that change all the time, and we have to, we have to be aware of those.
So before we move on to sort of the who, what, where of content at EY, tell me what you think has been the most challenging part of leading thought leadership or doing thought leadership at EY.
I think prioritization, although it is something everybody always agrees with, so long as it's not their area that's deprioritized, is difficult. And really getting that over the line, really being clear about what your big bets are, which is something I'm very keen on, isn't always easy. Another thing that I think we've spent a lot of time doing is through workshops and teach-ins and all sorts of other things, is actually bringing business along with us on the journey, on the kind of quality journey, and getting them to understand, in a sense, why we might say that their child is ugly, and giving them reasons for that. And it's never, it's not a message people like to hear, but it is something we have to do now and then. And there are quite good examples where there have been really senior leaders who have been absolutely adamant that a piece they've drafted is, the best thing to be said about a particular thing, and we have kind of challenged it. But if you can really challenge effectively and show them, we are lucky enough to be, on the whole, dealing with really intelligent people, really smart people, and so long as you make a good argument, you should be able to convince them. And I always say the same thing, none of us is as smart as all of us. So we're always talking about collective intelligence, and thought leadership is about bringing that collective intelligence into the market. So, you need to remember that.
Any counsel, any sort of tactical counsel for persuading senior stakeholders that a different way forward?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a great believer in showing people best practice. I think showing rather than telling is helpful. I think when you say things like, please write a provocative point of view, please write in clear sentences, but please don't use jargon. But if you can provide some really good examples, and it doesn't have to be your own examples. I mean, we routinely scour our competitor sites, even yours, Lucia, and we absolutely bring those best practice ideas in, and we say, look, this is how somebody else has written really well about this topic. This is, for us, nobody's done it better, and what can we learn from it? And then we kind of do a post-mortem, and we really investigate why we think something is good, and we try to demonstrate that as much as we can. And on the whole, I find anyway that is a fairly winning way of going about things. But you have to remember you're all on the same side. You can't sort of take up cudgels, that's not going to work.
Yeah, agree. Okay, let's start talking a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of the content. Who's your target audience, and has that target evolved over time, or has it been fairly consistent?
I think what I would say is we've always really targeted the C-suite, but I think in the past that was literally it, the C-suite. Now we are far more deliberate in thinking about target buyers and individual roles. So, if we're talking about talent and people, we're thinking about a CHRO. If we're talking about governance, we probably looking at the board, and we are really from the beginning thinking more specifically, and also groups of people who may need to come together. So we've done some interesting research recently on sustainability, and we did a series of interviews within the same company, and we interviewed a chief finance officer, a board member, and the CSO, and in the same company talked about how they navigated, say, sustainability within their organizations. And it was really, really interesting because you saw how some companies brought those roles very much together, how people speak different languages. I mean, CFOs don't speak the same language necessarily as somebody who's really passionate about green issues. So I think sometimes it's good to think about how C-suite really operates today, and it's not just the C-suite. It's also, C-suite -1 is also a very important audience for us. But yes, that's where we target.
And are you targeting mostly via your owned channel, or how do you think about mix of owned channel, third party?
Yeah, we do sort of what I think of as sort of native advertising. We work with HBO like everybody does, and Forbes and lots of other media owners. But our own channel is, I would say, is certainly important for our thought leadership, particularly. And I think where we've got proprietary research, we would like to be, we'd like that to be on our own site at least for some of the time. I think what we do like to do is certainly to do things that work really well on social. So we often do, say some animated data visualization from an important piece that will work well on social, and we hope that that will have a different kind of audience to people who aren't necessarily finding us on ey.com.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And tell us a little bit more about your research philosophy. You've invoked surveys.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have one philosophy. What I think some of our best work is where we've actually invested in really quite complex proprietary models. So I'll give you an example. There's everything at EY is acronyms, by the way. So this is known as ERTA, which is the Energy and Resources Transition Acceleration. I think I've got that right. Somebody's going to put it in the chat if I haven't. And it was a model that took some years to develop, and it takes about 50,000 data points twice a year, and it projects forward how quickly we're able to move and why. And it includes, geopolitical data. It includes, obviously, rare earth and mining. It includes all kinds of things. And I would say that the investment in that kind of thing, proprietary models that really don't exist in any of our competitors, are really valuable, and they have enormous brand value for us as well as client value. Everybody looks to them, and we have quite a few of them, not loads of them, but we have a few of them. But the other thing that we have started to do more of, and I'm very keen on, is where we have a survey. So a survey is telling you a lot about sentiment at the time, but that's all it's telling you. We have a survey that we do every 2 years called the Integrity Survey, and it surveys everybody from the board down to the factory floor about what they would be prepared to do for personal gain, whether they're happy to lie about their financial results, and all sorts of other things. It's an interesting survey. And this year,
super interesting. Hang on. Do you feel that people answer honestly on the survey?
Well, I won't tell you. You need to look at the results, but it is quite surprising how many very senior people admit to being perfectly happy to, for example, lying to their auditor. I mean, of course, it's anonymized. We don't go back.
Right, of course,
we don't sell the data. Police knocking at the door. But certainly it is surprising, and it's interesting because it varies over time. Because everybody thinks integrity is really important in business, but what are they actually prepared to do is really interesting. And we then looked at penalties and fines data from the US and the UK. Both have very good databases. And what we found, quick shorthand, is if a company is likely to fall foul of compliance in, say, environmental legislation, they are very much more likely to fall foul of any other kind of compliance and regulations. And what it tells you is this is all about culture. It's about actually, if you have a strong integrity culture from the top, it doesn't really matter what the regulation is. The chances are you will act with integrity right throughout the organization from the top to the bottom. And if you're not, then the chances are that goes across everything. So it was interesting. I mean, that was something we didn't know until we did the analysis. But I'm quite keen on this. I think it's really interesting for our clients to see both the sentiment side and then some hard data. I remember quoting PwC now, but their CEO survey 1 year, and I think it was about 3 years ago, they looked at the survey that talked about how important sustainability was for CEOs. And then they looked at how many of their compensation packages had any kind of reference to how sustainable the organization was. And the gap between those two was revealing. So I think in terms of research methodology, I would say the most important thing is to have a hypothesis. Don't go fishing in a big sea. Maybe there's something here, and ask big questions. So be very clear what it is you're trying to test. If you're going to do a survey, ensure that you really ask interesting questions. Don't ask questions you know the answers to, which a lot of surveys do. Think about, think about how the results are going to look. If you ask people to choose 5 out of a list of 10, you're going to get absolutely nothing back. I mean, you just can do the maths. It's just not going to work. So I think sometimes you just need to be very clear what it is you're hoping to really find out and what you're testing. But research methodology, I think, is moving forward very fast. I think it's a really exciting area. And I love, predictive analytics and scenario building and all kinds of ways of really analyzing data that we have now and then projecting it forward.
Fantastic. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about the increasing heterogeneity of content consumption preferences. And there's a question here from the audience. How does EY see the evolution in how your audience wants to consume insights? And this person says, I see a tension between novel versus traditional delivery approaches. So how do you think about formats, and how has your approach to storytelling evolved over time?
So slightly different questions. I'll start with storytelling. So obviously, as a recovering journalist, storytelling is something I'm very passionate about. I don't think it's done terribly well. And I think it's very incumbent on us to join the dots for our clients and audiences. So it's no good just reporting results. Here's what we found about talent. Here's what we found about technology. Here's what we found about process. Conclusion, actions to take. Very, very dull. You need to be able to tell a narrative, to look at cause and effect, which is what a narrative does, and to build that story. And it's not just because I think it's the right way to really explain a narrative, but also I think it's the way that people like to consume things. We're sort of built for storytelling. The second thing on formats, I think there's a lot of change and there's a lot of creative opportunity for all of us. We have had for some time a kind of digital first approach, but having said that, we still do an awful lot of downloadable PDFs, long form content that you have to read very long. We know that a lot of people a lot of our audiences basically access what we do on mobile, and we absolutely make sure that we have a kind of a good experience on mobile phones. I think that's going to grow. I think video and animated data visualization is a growth. We've invested, as many of us have, in podcasts, and some of those I think are as good as our long form thought leadership, where we've really understood an audience. So I think we will see more creative formatting. I think there's an opportunity for more interactivity. We don't do a lot of that, but I think it's coming, and gamification. I think we need to think about how we can really engage audiences in different ways. And then the final thing, which is very much driven by AI, is personalization. And that will be the future, I think, is to be able to deliver thought leadership to an individual client in a way that they really, really want to see it.
Agree. Do you see evidence that your target audience is actually engaging with these long form pieces?
Well, we know how many are downloaded, so we do see that. We can obviously, we also know how many will be reading, say, a 3,000-word article online compared with downloading a full report that might be 10,000 words.
Right.
So we can kind of do a bit of compare and contrast, but we never know. If somebody downloads something and shares it among, we don't know. So there's always going to be an element, I think, in thought leadership that you can't measure, and you have to you look at the things you do know, and then you have to extrapolate from that. I mean, sometimes I was on a plane journey once. It was a while ago. It was going to Hong Kong, and I was so excited because I could see somebody in first class, and I was not in first class, obviously. And they had obviously, their secretary had printed out for them one of our reports, and they had it there in their reading pile. And I almost went up to this guy and said, "Oh, I worked on that." I didn't, but you can't tell. People still print stuff out. I mean, I'm amazed that anybody prints anything, but it does happen. So I think long form still has legs. I mean, if you look at some of our, if you look at the way that something like The Atlantic does long form content, and the audiences they get are very high. So I think you can say, oh, we're living in a generation of attention deficit, and everybody wants everything in snackable bite sizes. That isn't completely the truth. I'm not saying that doesn't have a part to play, but I think the real trick is to do things in lots of different ways.
Right.
To invest heavily in one thing, and then to have lots of different formats that come out of it. That's the trick.
Yeah, we have the same experience. Does EY have an app for thought leadership, or no?
It doesn't. No.
No. Okay, so let's talk about Gen AI. You just alluded to it in terms of N of one personalization, which we're all thinking about. What's happening with Gen AI at EY? How do you see Gen AI affecting the way you generate thought leadership, the way you the ideas that you bring to the table to be developed into thought leadership? Let's talk AI.
Yeah. So EY is invested in a sort of proprietary version of ChatGPT, which we all use. And I have to say, it's super easy to use, and it's incredibly useful for certain things. So if you want to summarize something, you may have done 5 or 6 long form reports, and you just want to remember what the key data points are in them. It'll do that fantastically well. It will provide you with a deck if you want. It will it will draft something. I mean, I don't use it for drafting personally, but I know a lot of people do. But I think what you have to remember is it's constantly backward looking. It's looking at what's already been done, and it's very good if that's what you need at any time. In terms of creating new, clearly that is not what Gen AI can do at the moment. Not really. I mean, it creates new, but it creates it from old pieces. So it's great at that. I think in terms of thought leadership, it's a challenge because I think Gen AI can now produce a very reasonable looking report that most of us would say was, well structured, lots of data points, perfectly good, and it can produce it very quickly and very cheaply. But it's melding together stuff that's already existed. And I always use the metaphor. It's a bit like, being a luxury brand and investing heavily in your Hermes beautiful, very expensive handbags and having knockoffs down the market and being very clear what the differences are. And superficially, the differences may not be obvious. But I think it's incumbent upon those of us who are investing heavily in thought leadership to make it very clear what the hallmarks of that Hermes handbag are, what makes it different, how are we really building value? Because we're certainly costing more. So we are challenged all the time, I think, to make sure that if we're expecting people to know the difference, we've got to show what that difference is. And I think that's important. But Gen AI has got already, fantastic number of uses at EY, and we're using it for all kinds of things. And it's certainly making life quicker. We also use AI for white space analysis and all of that kind of thing, web crawling. We do all of that as well.
You do?
Yeah.
And do you find it effective for white space analysis?
We are finding it pretty effective, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Any challenges with adoption among your editorial team?
Adoption of Gen AI?
You have Gen AI. Mm-hmm.
I think in the editorial team, I think we would all say at the moment it isn't able to do what we are able to do.
Right.
I would like to think. But whether that will be true forever, I think is an open question. And I certainly, but I think at the moment it can't. It writes in a rather bland, beige way. I mean, that's the nature of it. Perfectly accurately, but without much personality. And I think you need to use it for what it's good for. I mean, that's what I would say. I think you need to experiment with it and use it what it's good for.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Any predictions for thought leadership in 2025 and what'll be hot and what not?
Well, I've already said I think there'll be more video. I think we are in a very visual age, and I think, people get quite bored with lots of text. So I think, breaking things up, making them move and having pictures is important. Certainly data visualization is one of my many passions. And I think we don't always do data storytelling as well as, for example, the New York Times does. So I think we can sometimes learn. I mean, admittedly, they're probably investing more heavily, but, Reuters and others have some really fantastic data visualizations that, I only wish we had done. So I think we can learn always from other people, and I think we will continue to learn from not just other media, but anybody really who's kind of providing content experiences. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what about longer range? How do you see thought leadership changing over the next, say, decade?
Well, I'm far too sensible to make a prediction. I don't get ahead. That's super, super hard. I mean, who knows? I think it will always. I think spreading good ideas that work, which is Seth Godin's famous sentence, I think will always be in fashion. So it's our job really to continually experiment with that. How do we spread ideas that work? Mm-hmm. And it may well be in 10 years' time that we're doing it in ways that we can't foresee at the moment. I mean, we, as an organization at EY, we do far more experiences than we used to. We have these series of wave space places all over the world, in cities all over the world, and we bring clients together and we create a kind of, experience the future things, and they're really popular, and we are capturing all kinds of insights as a result of those. So I think experiential learning is something that, ironically, in this world of digital, is now even more important than it used to be. Mm-hmm. And I think that will continue.
Mm-hmm. And last question, any interesting pieces of research on the radar that you're particularly excited about or proud of? that you want to flag for our audience between now and, the beginning of the
My
year
chance
or
to
year end?
advertise. Well, I happen personally to have got involved in some generational research, which is not something that I've done before. And I'm very excited about this. So we are just at the moment in the field with a large global study, 20,000 Gen Zers all over the world. And we're asking lots of questions about, work and success, optimism, and all kinds of things. I haven't got the results, so I can't tell you. But we are more and more interested in generational dynamics in the workplace and how younger generations are changing how we see work and challenging us in ways that I think are really interesting. So not just job hopping, which a lot of people talk about, but also having a side gig, having a side hustle shouldn't be an issue, that you bring your authentic self to work, that you care a lot about your peers and you can be transparent with your peers. There are lots of ways in which I can see the workplace changing as a result of younger generations coming in. And although some of that is, there's data that I've seen, I've actually been really in the weeds with it, and I found it absolutely fascinating. Really, really fascinating.
And when will that publish?
That will publish in January.
Okay.
And we've also done a companion piece, which is about Gen Z's sort of AI literacy, which has also been very interesting. And again, that's a global survey, so we're able to compare, what young people in Africa think compared with, say, in Japan. And that's coming out just before Christmas. So we're doing a little bit on generations at the moment.
Fascinating, fascinating. Okay, Lyde, I'm going to ask you one more. Most important question. You are on the advisory board of GTLI. Why? Why is GTLI important to you, and what impact do you hope it will have?
Well, I'm really excited to be part of this. I think having a really strong collegiate atmosphere among key players in this field is a fantastic opportunity for all of us. For me, it's a school. I just really look forward to learning all the time from all of you. But I also hope that it will be a way of spreading good ideas, really understanding best practice and what makes it work, looking at standards, which I think are really important. And I'm so pleased that we're part of the APQC because of that. So standardizing what we mean by good versus not so good. And then really hoping to, elevate everybody and be an inclusive church and include lots and lots of different people who are, sometimes working in very different environments, smaller teams, but, have very similar ambitions. So I'm very excited about the prospects for the GTLI.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you so much, Liz. Again, for more about upcoming events hosted by the Global Thought Leadership Institute, including future webinars and our first annual live in real life convening this coming February 6th, 2025 in Houston, Texas. Visit the APQC website at apqc.org/GTLI. And again, Liz, thank you so much for joining us today. And thanks, of course, to everyone in our audience. And see you in December when we will talk with Jeff Potter. He was just up, who leads advisory insights for KPMG. Have a great day or evening and be well.
Thanks, everybody.